Welcome to the Regulatory Transparency Project's 4th Branch podcast series. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker.
This is Linda Chavez. Welcome to all of our listeners, and I'm joined today by 2 scholars, and they also happen to be old friends of mine. The first is Mike Gonzalez. He is the Angelus T. Arredondo E. Pluribus Unum Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Mike has a long and illustrious career. He was a journalist for many years, then went into government, and since then he has been at the Heritage Foundation, and he is the author of 3 books: BLM, The Making of a New Marxist Revolution, which was published by Encounter Books in 2021. Also, The Plot to Change America, How Identity Politics is Dividing the Land of the Free, also published by Encounter Books in 2020. And finally, A Race for the Future, How Conservatives Can Break the Liberal Monopoly on Hispanic America, published by Crown Books in 2014. Also with us today is GianCarlo Canaparo, who is a Senior Legal Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. Edwin Meese III, Center for Legal and Judicial Studies. His research focuses primarily on constitutional and administrative law, and he writes on several constitutional topics. He has also been at the Heritage Foundation since 2019 after 2 years as a law clerk to a federal district court judge. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And we're going to talk today about the term equity. And this is an explainer. We're going to actually get into what equity means. But I want to start off the conversation by having a short discussion about why this matters. A lot of us are very familiar with the term DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. DEI is now ensconced in universities, in corporations. Many Fortune 500 companies have statements on DEI. Have whole divisions within the company that deal with DEI. And we've seen it really spread throughout society, including into the U.S. military. And I think a lot of people hearing this term, diversity, equity, and inclusion, well, they're familiar with diversity. Going back to the Bakke decision, it was one of the ways in which the Supreme Court countenanced race preferences. That, of course, was overturned by recent Supreme Court decisions involving Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And inclusion is kind of who's opposed to inclusion? Everybody wants to have themselves included. But equity is really the term in that trio that gives us some pause. And it gives us pause because it is a very amorphous idea. And for people like myself who've been in civil rights law, I go back to the 1972 when I worked at the Judiciary Committee on Capitol Hill on the Civil and Constitutional Rights Subcommittee. And when we think about anti-discrimination law, as it was promulgated in the 1960s in particular, one of the cornerstones of that was the idea that individuals should be guaranteed equal protection of the laws, that all laws should apply equally to them, regardless of their race or sex or national origin. And so, I think a lot of people hear equity and they think that's what it means, but it's come to mean a very different thing. I'm going to start off with you, Mike. Tell us how this term has transmogrified, and also maybe what the turning point, when that happened.
So first, I can't start this podcast by not recognizing that I'm here with an icon, Linda Chavez. You know the admiration that I feel for you, and with one of my really favorite colleagues, GianCarlo, and I also very much like the Federalist Society. First to go back to inclusion and diversity. they are also very troublesome. Diversity means racial quotas, and inclusion means that if you're wearing a Jesus hat or a pro-life T-shirt, you get kicked out of a mall or you get kicked out of the Smithsonian. And these are real cases that I'm referring to. But equity is the one that I think bothers most people, because equity sounds like equality, and most people think it's synonymous with equality. And I think GianCarlo here will give the legal definition of the background in law of equity, but it has come to mean the functional opposite of equality, because it means that the government or the private sector must give Americans different benefits depending on their race or any category that they're in. If they're in a marginalized category, be it racial or sexual, they deserve to get a top up. They deserve to get more, and that goes against the American ideal. As included in our founding documents. I think where it pivots is because the Civil Rights Act was something that prevented federal contractors and the government from treating people differently because of their race, and that's what it says in the original Kennedy executive order was very clear about that. I think it pivots in the speech at Howard University that LBJ gives on a commencement June 4th, 1965, written by Patrick Daniel Moynihan, in which he says, he uses a racehorse analogy. He says you cannot treat a man that starts behind in the race the same way that you treat the person that starts ahead. That's something that was used first by Herbert Crowley of the Progressives, the founder of the New Republic, I think in an article he wrote in 1910. And it's this idea, and we can go more into that if you'd like, but I don't want this to be too long. It's the idea that if you are a member of a marginalized category, you must get more from the government and from your company than somebody who is in a privileged category. That obviously, and by the way, the best spokesperson for this is Kamala Harris. She has been very clear about this. Biden says equity. He's been told to say equity. He does it for cynical political reasons. Kamala Harris understands it in the way I've just described it and has explained it in a video that she made in 2020, but many times. By equity, she means people get different benefits because of their category.
Let me just further explore that a little before I turn to you, GianCarlo. When I heard the Johnson speech, and of course I've studied it since then, when I heard the analogy of a man shackled and then put at the starting line, you don't expect him to be able to cross the finish line in the same speed as somebody who's been training forever. That's true. But of course, in 1965, when we were talking about this issue, the civil rights laws had just been passed. And as I envisioned it, what it meant was you're going to have to give training, experience. People are going to have to be prepared to be able to compete. I certainly never thought of it as that means we're going to put you halfway down the track and let you start the race from there and then, cross over, or we're going to artificially just have you cross over and the finish line and be able to equal it. So it was originally, I think, a lot of people thought it meant we do recognize that people have unequal preparation. And so what we have to do is close the skills gap. But that, of course, is not how it turned out, right?
I think to a lot of people, what the civil rights promise meant was what it means to, for example, Shelby Steele. What he says is, you're free. You're now free. Enjoy your freedom. I don't think, and in fact, in the law, in the Civil Rights Act, and Herbert Nixon's VP, Minnesota Senator
Hubert Humphrey
was very clear about this when he argued in the Senate. He said this will not mean racial quotas. This will not mean racial benefits. If this results in racial quotas, I will eat every page of this Civil Rights Act. Of course, he died.
Apparently of indigestion.
No, he died before the Bakke decision. Yes. So he didn't have to. he didn't have to eat every page of the Civil Rights Act, but the Bakke decision in 1778 pretty much codified into law this unequal benefits to people who are in the categories deemed by the state to be marginalized.
So, GianCarlo, let's talk about the legal meaning of equity, quite apart from civil rights. So why don't you give us a little précis on, what equity means in the legal sense throughout
absolutely.
the law?
So equity in the law is very, very different than the phrase we're sort of familiar with today. Equity comes from 1,000 years ago in England. England used to have courts of law and courts of equity, which were separate. And the way that a lawsuit worked in England was you had very specific sort of legal claims you could bring. And if you couldn't fit a particular claim for justice or claim for a remedy within the very particular confines of a specific legal claim, you were sort of out of luck. But there were plenty of cases in which clearly injustice had been done and justice was needed, which didn't fit. So you had these courts of equity where courts could sort of craft a just remedy outside of law. So if you wanted, say, to get somebody off your land who was occupying it unfairly, or if somebody, a skilled craftsman had promised you a sort of irreplaceable, unique item which money damages wouldn't fix, they could compel it to be handed over. They could give injunctions. This is an equitable remedy. And American courts have sort of adopted this tradition of law and equity, but our courts today sort of blend the two together, and you don't very often find, except in a few states, separate courts of law and equity. But when a court today gives an injunction, that's an equitable remedy. Or when it compels in a contract what we call specific performance rather than giving money damages, that is an equitable remedy. But this is the original history, and there were some interesting rules that went along with equity, which is that if you went to the court and sort of threw yourself on its sense of justice, its equitable sense of justice, you had to do justice, right? You couldn't, if you had unclean hands when you approached the court and asked for equity, you wouldn't get equity. There was a certain equality of fairness that was there. But that's where it came from. But to Mike's point about the transition, as we sit here in this studio, just outside the window, there's a poster from the movie An Image of an American. So I'm seeing Frederick Douglass's face right there. And what that reminds me of, he has that famous speech, what should you do with a Black American, right? Leave us alone. Mm-hmm. The point is that there has always been this fight over what civil rights are in America. Is it giving advantages and handicaps on the basis of skin color, or is it a sort of, equality to go forth? And that's the fight. And I think in one sense, there are certain inflection points. Frederick Douglass was an inflection point. The LBJ speech was an inflection point. And then, in 2020, the George Floyd murder was an inflection point. And coming out of that, sort of, I think if anyone gets the most credit for the reinvention of equity, probably Ibram Kendi. Mm-hmm. And he writes this book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is immensely popular. And he defines equity, and he says equity is equal outcomes among racial groups. And he says the way you get that is by discriminating. On page, I think it's 22 of his book, he says, and I'll quote, "The only remedy for past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy for present discrimination is future discrimination." That's how we get equity, which is equal outcomes among racial groups.
And I think that's sort of the nub of the argument here, is this idea of government ensuring equal outcome. I think, Mike, you might be familiar with some governments that have tried to do that. We have seen, totalitarian systems, communist systems, where they at least promise everybody is going to be the same. But in order to do that, what do they have to do? Before I launch into that, because my book does cover this, I want to give a plug to my book, Next Gen Marxism, which is my latest book. Oh. And that was published in April, Next Gen Marxism, What It Is and How to Combat It, because I talk about all this. Now, yesterday, GianCarlo and I were talking in my office about this podcast. And what I said to him, and I want to say to you, is that
I've actually scoured the record, and Marx doesn't say anything about equality of outcome. And Marxists are always complaining about this. So it's like, stop blaming Marx for this. And so there's two things about equity that bother people. One is this promise of equality of outcome, and Kamala Harris says that in black and white. She says we want everyone to get the same. And I've written before I actually looked through Marx and found none. I said, no, this is the Marxist idea. It is the Marxist idea as Marxists have practiced it, but not as Marx wrote.
And of course, they didn't really practice it either,
of course.
right?
And you said, no, because you were right. I spent the first 12 years of my life in Cuba under the revolution. It was the craziest revolution ever, a crazy Caribbean revolution that destroyed a country and destroyed a society. As I always say, the communists are never able to build any building that pleases the eye. They only build gulags. They don't bake bread. They only create bread lines. So you're right. The result is that. But Marx really. So what bothers me the most about this. About the two things. One is within equity. One is the promise of equal outcomes, and the other one is treatment, different treatment according to your category. Marx actually does say something about that. He does say in the Critique of Goethe, I think in 1875, that people should get that equal rights is a bourgeois concept because people have different talents and they're going to get different outcomes, and that it makes no sense to treat people the same, that this bourgeois concept of equal rights, that people should be treated differently depending on their category. Now, the interesting thing is, and this is why I brought up my book, to Marx, the category that mattered was proletariat and bourgeois, the owner of capital.
It was class, right?
Yes, it was class. It was economic class. And your class depended on your relationship to the means of production. If you owned the means of production, you were bourgeois. If you were a lathe operator and you worked with the means of production, you were a proletariat. That's all that mattered to Marx. The conflict was there between these two. Today, we have abandoned the worker. The left has completely abandoned the worker and has gone over and has placed the revolutionary locus on the racial or sexual category. So today we give this advantage to the racial or sexual categories or anything that makes you marginalized, quote unquote.
So, GianCarlo, how has this manifested itself? I talked at the beginning about how we see these DEI statements in corporations, the military, schools, universities. How has it manifested itself in the law?
Yeah, a lot of different ways. Let me start with the administration. So right at the beginning of Biden's administration, he put out a executive order saying that we are doing a whole of government approach where every single agency under my control must advance racial equity. And what that has looked like is race preferences in all sorts of ways. So priority COVID-19 treatments and vaccines on the basis of race, priority federal loans to farmers, business people of particular races and not others, and then sometimes equity is sort of the motivating force in those cases. Sometimes equity is just sort of a cover for other politics. So the student loan bailout was framed as equity. Which was sort of ironic, right? Because disproportionately white and Asian people have student loan debt, right?
And only about a third of Americans have four-year degrees, so forget everybody else.
And then in the sort of growing gray zone where public and private power meet, so the administration has funneled billions of dollars of grant money to organizations that explicitly say, we are doing things for this racial group and not that one, or that racial group and not that one, which is an interesting sort of.
Have they been challenged? And because my recollection was the COVID relief.
Yes, they have been consistently challenged and they have consistently lost. The problem is, for every lawsuit, every judicial victory is a rearguard victory, and for every lawsuit that gets filed, there are 5,000 actions of a similar vein that are not challenged. So that's what it looks like in the administration. What it looks like in the private sphere, similar things. So, for instance, the Harvard case, right? Schools deciding, we need equity in our student bodies, which means that our student bodies must match the demographic breakdown of the rest of the country. And because Asian and white people tend to get in at higher rates, they have higher test scores.
Asians in particular,
right? They're at the top of the academic credential pile for sure. They have to be kept out by various means. In Harvard's case, Harvard said, well, we'll just sort of across the board give them bad marks on personality. So there's that. Corporations now do all sorts of things. They will give, sometimes they'll give preferences in hiring, quite explicitly. Of course, there's no doubt, there's no debate that that's illegal, but they'll do it, right? They will create affinity groups inside corporations where you get all sorts of benefits, mentoring, promotion prospects, sometimes even stipends and bonuses for participating in affinity groups on the basis of these characteristics.
Let me go back to you, Mike, on this question, because again, you talk about the Lyndon Johnson speech at Howard. And when the Civil Rights Law was originally passed, I think most people had in mind trying to ensure that there not be racial discrimination against Black Americans, people who had not been voluntarily resettled in America, but had been brought here in chains as slaves. And there was no doubt that there was pernicious, severe, and pervasive discrimination against people who are Black. It wasn't just in the South. It was very concentrated in the South because that's where many Blacks live, but it also occurred in the North. Now, when you're talking about diversity and who is eligible for this equity that GianCarlo has nicely described under the law or in practice by the administration or in private institutions, we're talking about a plethora of groups. It's no longer Blacks, former descendants of former slaves that we're talking about. We're talking about a huge number of people who came here under very different circumstances and have very different traditions. Talk about that a little bit and what that's meant.
Yeah, and I want to repeat what you just said. I think in 1964, and we had horrific conditions. We had Jim Crow. We had all sorts of things that needed to be fixed and were fixed. And everybody, I think there was a consensus on fixing it, Republicans and Democrats. The Civil Rights Act passes with Republican votes, not with Democrat votes.
Right.
And I think the country expected to move away from thinking about race. But you're absolutely right. Now we have all these races. GianCarlo and you were just talking about Asians. No, it's not Asians. It's primarily Indian Americans from the subcontinent, obviously, not Pakistani, not Bangladeshi, and then Chinese Americans and Korean Americans to some degree. But it's not Indonesian Americans. It's not Filipino Americans. We have the federal government has created this pan-ethnic category, Asian Americans, which is nonsensical. These are very disparate people, but I think what has turned out to happen is very ironically, Indian Americans and Chinese Americans have demonstrated that if you practice the virtues, if you have an intact family, if you study, if you work hard, but especially the intact family part, you will succeed in this country. That America is equitable. That America is a place that where you have more or less the rule of law, and where you can attain the American dream if you take the right actions. I think that. And by the way, you were talking about Black Americans. There are many. That's another category. There are many subgroups within Black Americans who do very, very, very well. Ghanaian Americans and Nigerian Americans do very well. In fact, in mean household income, Nigerian Americans sometimes beat white Americans. I think right now they're a bit behind in mean household income, but it's an indicator that moves from year to year.
And Caribbean Americans are quite different from
West Indian Americans. Do in fact studies. Columbia has done studies of second generation West Indians, and shows how much better. And they looked at second generation because they don't have the accent. They're just Black Americans. So a racist cop, a racist shop owner is going to treat them equally badly, and yet they do very well. They do much better than the rest. So I think what we need to do is break down these categories, have the census, and I'm on record as saying that the census needs to move away from these categories that were only added in 1980. This is not Hamilton or Thomas Jefferson. We're talking about 1980. This is talking about Jimmy Carter again, 1977, the Policy Directive number 15, and ask real questions. Is your family intact? Things that actually the social science is rich with evidence that is very strongly connected to outcomes. What we want to know is outcomes. Why do you have good outcomes? Why do you have dysfunctional outcomes? And what can government do, if anything? Because sometimes government cannot do anything to help Americans thrive.
And I think you remember, Mike, that I wrote a book way back in 1991 about Hispanics in the U.S.
Out of the Barrio.
Out of the Barrio.
It's a classic, which I have quoted many, many times, Linda. And
one of the things that I did is to break down this whole Hispanic group, because, again, this was an artificial creation.
Right.
They lumped together primarily Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, and Cuban Americans, and treated them the same, even though they had very different experiences and very different outcomes. Right. And one of the things that was very important that I discovered in that, first of all, English, being able to speak English was like the single most determinative thing, no matter what your background was. And that's largely because you're talking about a very heavily immigrant population. So the second and third generation, by then, they'd learned English. English became the dominant language. But you talk about the intact family. And I had a chapter called The Puerto Rican Exception, because what I showed was Mexican Americans and Cuban Americans. Cuban Americans in particular did very well. They came as refugees from communism. Many of them were educated and they had skills. Not all. And Mexican Americans, although they came in, their trajectory appeared much more like Italian Americans. They started out on the lower rungs, but they, by the third generation, had moved up the rungs, had begun to get more education, etc. And but families were more intact. They weren't always married. There was a lot of common law marriage that occurred in these communities, but children grew up with their biological father and biological mother, and that had
and a lot
tremendous,
of comadres.
And right, a lot of aunts and others, right? It's but that is important, and I think people need to focus on that more.
One thing I'll bring up on this topic with respect to racial equity again. The framework that so-called or self-described anti-racists are always trying to impose a sort of racial equity on the basis of these very classifications, which make no sense, right? It's constantly, we need racial equity, which means equal outcomes between, for example, whites and blacks. But those groups actually make no sense whatsoever, right? Just a few interesting statistics. 20% of black people in America are first or second generation immigrants, right? These are people who have never been here pre the Civil Rights Act. While, as Mike said, Indian Americans do very well getting into med school, there was an article about a woman who was Hmong, who had tried to get into, I think it was Harvard or Yale med school. There had never, ever, ever been a Hmong medical student, but they kicked her out. They didn't kick her out, but they didn't get her in because she was Asian, right?
And Hmong, by the way, are a very small minority of the mostly Cambodian population.
Right.
They're
but look at the category of Asian, right? That is everybody from Pakistan to Japan and all the way down to Indonesia and some of the islands, but not all of the islands. Mm-hmm. But if you are, say, Pashtun, right? This is an ethnic tribe which lives in the area
straddles the line.
So your cousin could be in Afghanistan, and you could be 4 miles away across the border. He's white, you're Asian.
Yes, right. Yeah, I mean, is that not part of the real problem here, is that we continue to try to divide people by color? Isn't that what we were supposed to be getting away from with the civil rights laws?
It was done on purpose, as you know. They needed, leftist activists in the 1970s advocated for this, Mao-Ma'd the bureaucracy into doing it. In one of my books, I cite this exchange between an activist and as somebody at the Census Bureau in the 1970s who says, we have all you need. We have all the information. Where were you born? Where was your father born? What language do you speak at home? And the activist responded, we don't want data. We want the group. and there's a reason for that, because if you're going to place the locus of revolution, of change, of dismantling society, because if society is systemically racist, you need systemic overhaul. If you're going to place the onus of revolution on the racial category, you need racial groups who are angry, who are filled with grievances. So you need to do that. So it was all done on purpose. Obviously, by the way, they're losing. My good friend here, GianCarlo, mentioned the Kendi book earlier. In its latest edition, he's gotten rid of that language.
Yes, he has. Yes,
and he's complaining bitterly because he says, "I've been introduced. I never meant to say this. I never meant to say what he says in plain English." So he has had to get rid of this, segregation forever language.
But I'll mention, although that particular line is gone, the logic that supports it is still there.
Oh, completely.
Right. It's just cosmetic.
No, it's just his editor said, "Come on, Kendi."
Yeah. Well, let's talk in our remaining few minutes here about the future and where we're going. One of the things that's been interesting to observe over the last few months, really, has been the way in which DEI, which had, seemed to have put deep roots into corporate America, for example, has suddenly... many of these companies are not so enthusiastic about it. I served as a corporate board member for almost 30 years in different corporations, including one Fortune 500 company. And one of the things I learned in the board is, what really matters to the board and to the shareholders? Whether or not the company is making money and returning profits to its shareholders. And this stuff doesn't produce results. So what do you see happening? I'll go first to you, GianCarlo, and then back to you, Mike.
Yeah. So I have an interesting theory about this. I think that in a sort of counterintuitive way, the decision in Students with Fair Admissions versus Harvard gets a lot of credit, even though the decision only eliminated an exception to the Civil Rights Act that schools alone got, right? Doesn't actually apply on its face directly to, say, government discrimination or private discrimination, except to the extent that, it calls into question use of these arbitrary categories. But what it does, I think, again, as I said at the beginning, we're always sort of having this fight between what the civil rights vision of America is. Is it equal outcomes imposed by the government and private power, or is it sort of true equality before the law? We're always having this fight, and the pendulum is constantly swinging. And what the Supreme Court did, even though the pure legal impact of its decision is very limited, it sort of shone a light towards the vision of Frederick Douglass, right? Towards the equality vision. And suddenly people realized, oh, wait a second, that's the way we ought to be going. And there's, law has only a limited ability to do this, and judicial opinions only less. But if they can sort of start a cultural wave that way, which is, I think, what happened, and if the rest of us can sort of keep it going, that's what's going on.
Could I also suggest, in terms of corporations, you also have those boards sitting around saying, gee, Harvard just got sued, UNC just got sued, they lost. What happens, asking the general counsel of the corporation, what happens if we get sued because of our
and
DEO
they've sort
program?
of assumed for so long, we can do this racially discriminatory stuff. We haven't been sued, right? And then suddenly they're like, oh, wait a second, maybe I should go reread the Civil War, the 64 Act. Oh, wait a second, I can't discriminate on the basis of race and employment? Okay, let's reevaluate.
So I think there's several things that are happening to just follow from what GianCarlo was saying. I think where you were going to go, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you were going to say the Students of Fair Admissions decision wrongly gets a credit for stopping this. It was happening before, right? The pendulum was already swinging, and Students of Fair Admissions, because the journalists love to blame the court for this. Was that what you were going to say?
Actually, no. I think that Students of Fair Admissions gets some credit for the shift away from DEI.
No, that's right.
Yes.
But I always tell journalists, it's not just Students of Fair Admissions that did it. It is a whole national resistance to this. This is alien to the body politics, and any alien thing and it gets regurgitated. So I think you're right, but let me parse it, Linda, that corporations are moving away from this. And we see it all the time. They're moving away, especially from the LGBTQIA, what do they call it, human rights campaign, and their index and all that, and that's all to be welcomed. I don't want us to do a victory lap just yet, because I think even though you're right, Linda, that boards and the C-suite should be interested in what makes a company money, but if the incentives are built in so that you enter the C-suite from Harvard and then you really don't care whether this is profitable or not, you will be acclaimed, that you will be rewarded if you speak the language of DEI, if you speak the language of ESG, if you implement it. And this is what you have been taught at Harvard, at Cornell, at Princeton. And I'm not against the Ivies, by the way. I want to retake the Ivies. I don't want to burn the Ivies. I want to retake them. They don't belong to Claudine Gay. They belong to America. But we have to be very aware that the incentive system right now in place is for these people entering the corporations and the C-suite especially to pursue and implement ESG. And we need to continue to fight this tooth and nail.
And I will say, by the way, when you talk about incentives, many corporations ended up basically integrating DEI into their bonus system.
Right.
So if you didn't accomplish the goals that they wanted you to in terms of hiring and promoting, et cetera, it could hit you in your bonus, and that does
that's the kind of deconstruction we need to do.
Yeah. And so just very quickly, if you could sort of give me, 2 minutes each on what the solution is to this equity fight and what we can do.
Sure. Well, as the civil rights lawyer here, I'll say lawsuits are great on this point. The law is really quite clear, right? The Civil Rights Act doesn't permit this sort of nonsense. Every state has an act like this. The equal protection jurisprudence doesn't tolerate this sort of thing. And now that the Supreme Court in particular has directed its gaze on the arbitrariness of these categories, that has opened up a new front in litigation. Because if there's one thing the law will not tolerate, it's arbitrariness. And what we've learned from Mike's research, from David Bernstein's research, from your research, and now from the Supreme Court in students of admission is that there is nothing in public policy to which you can apply these categories we've got that isn't just complete nonsense. And that's only going to increase as we get more immigrants, there's more interracial marriage. So lawsuits are great. But again, like I said a moment ago, the law is not the best tool for this kind of thing. This is fundamentally a cultural thing.
Why don't you pick up on that, Mike? Talk a little bit about that.
Well, perfect. I'm so glad that GianCarlo mentioned the culture, because this is a culture war, and we need to understand this. The other side wants to commit cultural genocide. They want to dismantle American culture, and they never tell us what they want to replace it with. They're never explicit. We know from the outcomes in different places that it ends up in central planning, in collectivism, in bad stuff happening, bad outcomes, really bad outcomes. So we need to expose it. This is what I try to do. This is what GianCarlo tries to do in my book, Next Gen Marxism. And we need to say this is a very Marxian, it stems from a very Marxian view of the world that divides all of human interaction into oppressors and oppressed. It excludes St. Paul's idea that we're no longer slave nor master, but we all belong to God. But what do we do beyond that? We actually do need to look at the disparities, because they based everything on the disparities. They say the disparities which are real, that are in everything from education to income to housing, they say they're prima facie evidence of systemic racism. And we have to say, no, prove it. Don't just assert it, prove it. I have here a lot of evidence in the social sciences that the disparities have to do with the background variables, especially family intactness. I have proof I have the social sciences. Brookings says it. The Heritage Foundation says it. So I have my proof, and we need to deal with this. And we need to have the courage to when they say, well, you're attacking us or attacking. No, because this is colorblind. Family dysfunction is a killer among whites, is a killer among all groups. So we need to deal with this because we need to, if you're invested in the success of all Americans, I think we need to have the courage to deal with that.
Thank you both very much. This has been, I think, a very informative and really thoughtful conversation. Thank you to
Thank you, Linda.
Michael Gonzalez and to GianCarlo Canaparo. And I am Linda Chavez signing off.
On behalf of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project, thanks for tuning in to the Fourth Branch podcast. To catch every new episode when it's released, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spreaker. For the latest from RTP, please visit our website at regproject.org. That's regproject.org.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.